You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
Well, hey everyone, welcome back to Faith and Other Oddity, the show where Emily and I read the Bible and talk about it and do the best we can. This week, as you can probably hear, it's going to be a little sketchy for me. I've had a cold the last couple days, so I've been laid out on the couch.
We didn't know if we were going to get to record this week.
Yeah, and if we hadn't missed last week, we probably would not. I'm just kind of I'm barely here, so I might not be participating a whole bunch this week unless something really gets me awake.
Yeah, I was just thinking I need to hire Mickey to sit there and shoot you with a Nerf gun or something every so often. Just kind of ping you.
It was a long time to think about that. Are you sure our connection's good?
Well, it was doing better right up until we started recording. And it's like the minute we hit record, it's still there. It's just mostly there.
Okay. Well, if it gets too bad, we'll stop and reconnect. But yeah, so we were not here last week because Thanksgiving. Mickey and I traveled in to see the family and trying to get again to spend as much time with Mom as her health continues to decline. But so we do appreciate everyone's patience. If it gets to where we're missing too much, I'm thinking of suspending the Patreon. We'll kind of see how that goes. But I definitely don't want to be shortchanging any of our listeners. Let us know how you feel about that, and also feel free to adjust if you feel like we're not posting often enough. I really do not want to.
Right.
I don't want to feel like we're taking advantage of anyone because we just have that out there. Is if you feel like you want to support us, that's great. If not, there's no obligation. We just want this information out there. So
well, and we're just in a weird season right now, so things are kind of up in the air, and we just kind of have to play everything by ear. So day by day, sometimes moment by moment. So.
Yep. Absolutely. But that being said, I know you in the midst of all this have told me you had plenty of time to get to some notes made. So let's see what you got.
I made some notes. And so we are still in 1 Kings 7. I know we've been here for a while. We're going to be here for a little while longer. I don't know if we're going to get through all of the chapter this week or not. A lot of it's going to depend on how awake Nathan is. But we're picking up in verse 40 through 45. And I'm not going to read this because these verses are just a list of the various things that Hiram made for the temple. And, just real quickly, he made the pillars and the accessories with the pillars. Of course, the 400 pomegranates, the lattice work, and the bronze sea, all of that together. But then he made pots and shovels, basins, 10 stands, 12 bowls, all in bronze. And so, the point of a list like this is to let you know that this is really an impressive undertaking. There's massive amounts of work being done, and you should not forget how much work is going into this. It's supposed to just overwhelm you with information, which, is great whenever you're trying to read it because you get to see the space that all the words take up. And that really is part of writing sometimes, is seeing how much space the words take up. But reading it, yeah, whatever. Another point that's being made here is Hiram's involved in both the big things and the little things. He's not just doing the big projects. He's over the entire temple complex and everything that goes into it. So we're going to pick up in verse 46. It says, "In the plain of the Jordan, the king cast them in the clay ground between Succoth and Zarethan." Okay. First off, the king did not cast these. So if you just pull this verse out of context, you're going to think that Solomon's out there working with melting bronze and doing all the labor and stuff like that. When we say the king cast them, we're saying that he commissioned someone to do the work on his behalf. And so he had Hiram do this, and
well, it's like saying the president did something with the military. He didn't actually do that thing, but he made the decision.
Exactly. So this is an idiom, and this is one of those reasons why we need to be reading in context. We need to be reading with some common sense. We need to be working through the text for what it's trying to tell us, not what we want it to say. Because I did run across some commentaries that actually claim that, see, Solomon actually did this. The only way that works is if you ignore the rest of the chapter. And if you ignore convention and standard protocols. So, these are the kinds of things that get, excuse me, that's that time of year, Oklahoma again. These are the kind of things that get people making stupid observations.
But that means you're not taking the Bible literally. I mean, the plain reading of the text, right?
Yes. Let's just own it. I'm not taking the Bible literally. I'm not reading it literally. I'm reading it according to the standards and protocols that it has put in place according to genre and cultural mandates. So why do I have to read it literally when that actually butchers the text? And matter of fact, it was one of the things that I found very interesting. I've been doing some research on the Kabbalah because we keep brushing up against it in various places, and I don't want to be ignorant or give people the wrong impression. So I was listening to scholarly lectures, and one of the observations that was made was the Kabbalists did not read the Bible with some kind of grand esoteric demands. They actually read it very literally. And one of the ways they proved this point was whenever we start to look at words like Shekinah, that's feminine. When we look at a ruach, that's feminine. So these, the Shekinah glory of God, that's believed to be a feminine aspect of God. The ruach, the spirit of God, is believed to be a feminine aspect of God. And of course, then they build off of that. So when we read too literally, we actually wind up creating more difficulties, if not heresies, because we're holding on to this sense of pride we have that we can't allow the Bible to tell us how to read it. We have to say this is how we read stuff because this is how I understand words. You need to be better at reading. If that's your position, you need to read better. Because most of the theologies and most of the viewpoints I've encountered that I disagree with concerning the Bible are from people who very much die on that hill. I have to read this literally. And then they will contextualize the parts they don't like because everybody contextualizes something. It's just that simple. So I see your brain working.
I can't say it on the podcast. I'll tell you afterwards.
Okay. So anyhow, okay. The second thing this verse tells us is that the casting happened, and the word here is literally in the thickness of the ground between Zuccoth and Zarathan. This is clay. This is a layer of thick clay between the two towns. And so basically what it sounds like they might be doing, and it's kind of hard to be sure, is that they're actually might be building the molds for some of this directly into the ground. Or they could be gathering it and for certain things and actually, sculpting smaller molds. But it would have taken massive amounts of clay to make these molds, okay? Because you've got to have molds that are strong enough to stand up against the weight of the amount of metal going into them. So it makes sense that you would actually work in a place where this kind of clay is very readily available because you would have to have, I'm trying to think of what it would take. I know that with my small castings, we were doing 2 to 3 inch walls around of just a small pour. So if you've got something that is the thickness of a hand's breadth and it's as big as a swimming pool, you're probably looking 1.5 feet, 2 foot deep at least around every edge. So that's a lot of clay. So it makes sense that you would work where the clay was readily available. And it's possible, and I read some claims, and I was trying to find out some more, couldn't get into the full conversation I wanted to with Becca, our resident archaeologist. But I read some claims that there was a discovery of Solomon's copper mines, which copper was one of the primary elements used in making bronze, there by Zarathan. And so if that is true, it makes sense that they would work between Zarathan and Sukkot, because now they've got the clay and the copper just right there. And so you work where you have the materials readily available, because we're talking about heavy materials. It just makes sense. And I know it's probably like spending way too much time on details that nobody else cares about. But if you've done this kind of work, it's kind of stuff that sticks out to you. So, verse 47, and Solomon left all the vessels unweighed because there were so many of them, and the weight of the bronze was not ascertained. So, again, if you're working by the mines, you're working near the place where it's being smelted, and you're just, you're producing it as quickly as you can. It makes sense, again, that you aren't going to take time to weigh the bronze that you're mining from your own mines. This isn't like gold that you're going to trade for. You're going to purchase that has an actual weight assigned to it because of how you acquire it. This is something completely different. I mean, another way to think of it, if I buy zucchini at Walmart, it goes in the scale and I'm going to pay per pound, and I'm going to know how much zucchini I have. If I get it out of my garden, it's never going to touch a scale. Why? I'm going to cook up what I want. So it's just a common sense thing. So verse 48 through 50, a list of gold implements that Solomon had made for the temple are laid out. There's an altar. There's the table for the bread of presence. There's the lampstands, 5 on the south, 5 on the north. So there's 10 of those. There are lamps, tongs, cups, snuffers, basins, dishes for incense, pans, sockets, doors with flowers for the Holy of Holies. Again, the gold altar here, this is not used for the sacrifice of meat or the burning of any kind of grain offering or anything like that. This is strictly used for incense, because incense does not burn hot enough to melt the gold. And it's a common belief that the gods, anything spiritual, actually fed on the fragrance of the sacrifice, that they didn't actually consume the material of the sacrifice. It's only whenever it was converted into a sweet and savory smell that it became something that the spiritual being, whether we're talking the God of the Bible or we're talking about some other God, could actually consume. And this was very much part of the mindset of the ancient Israelites. We know this because when you look at Leviticus, chapters 1, 2, 3, and 6, they all talk about this. Genesis 8:21 talks about this, Psalm 66:15, and then in the New Testament, we have Ephesians 5:2, Philippians 4:18, and 2 Corinthians 2:15. These are all verses that talk about the savory aroma of what's being offered to God, whether we're talking about a literal sacrifice or our prayers or our praise. So, this is not a concept that is outside of the Jewish belief and way of worship. So in First Kings, we have Solomon making these tables. It actually has him making one table, and this is one of those points where we're going to run into a little contradiction between here and Second Chronicles. Because in Second Chronicles 4, it says that Solomon made 10 tables total for the new temple. So the numbers on the temple as far as implements do not match up. We just need to acknowledge that. I don't think we need to do any kind of mental or historical acrobatics to try to make those line up. The point is the tools needed to fulfill the worship requirements in the temple are there. Solomon made sure they're there. Actually, he goes over and above. If he made 10, he goes beyond what was required according to God's dictates. And the rabbis actually say that the fact that he makes 10 of everything that he should have just made one of demonstrates his great love and devotion for God. And they also claim that he made these 10 to kind of flank the ones that Bezalel made for the tabernacle. So Bezalel's work was considered to be a centerpiece, with Solomon's actually kind of, acting as a framework around what Bezalel had created. So verse 51, thus all the work that King Solomon did on the house of the Lord was finished, and Solomon brought in the things David his father dedicated, the silver, the gold, the vessels, and stored them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. So this is another verse that gets overlooked by Christian commentaries and only gets dealt with very briefly. There's really not anything said about it. And y'all know me, if the Christian commentaries aren't going to talk about it, I'm going to start digging wherever I can to try to find out what's going on here. I thought this was very interesting because, we're told so often in Sunday school that when Solomon builds the temple, he takes all the stuff that David had acquired and he uses that as the material for the temple. But then here it seems like he's not used it at all, that he's actually storing it now. And so that just seemed really odd to me, that there seems to be this discrepancy. And the suggestion that Abinel made was that Solomon believed so deeply that David was, not allowed to participate in the building of the temple, that he didn't even use the treasures that David had gathered. Instead, he hung on to them, and they were used for the daily operating cost of the temple. And so that way they weren't incorporated into the actual structure of the temple. I kind of get it. I mean, Solomon tends to be someone who goes over and above. He's someone who he needed one table, so he makes 10. He needs one lampstand, he makes 10. When he makes sacrifices, he makes over the top sacrifices. So why wouldn't he go above and beyond in this aspect too? And I think sometimes we expect things to line up with very simple answers, and to be able to say, oh, well, this is what I learned in Sunday school. And then when we have to stop and think about it, it's like your brain kind of fries a little bit. And so you don't want to deal with it. You don't want to actually pause and look at what the ramifications are. And I have to wonder sometimes if that's what Christian commentators are doing. Are they going, this doesn't line up with what I heard, so I'm just going to brush by it? And I don't know why we do that, because those are often the most interesting points. So, but I figured this was probably a good time to address the elephant in the room, because in the middle of all of this research, one of the things I did keep running across were different articles of people complaining that this description of the temple showed that Solomon was incapable, or that Judaism in general was incapable of maintaining their own commandments that God had given them. Specifically, that the second commandment, not to make any kind of image, was being violated here in this description of the temple, because obviously we have lots of imagery. We have palm trees, we have pomegranates, we have cherubim, we have gourds, we have all of these different things. And so you have to ask, what is going on? Where did the second commandment go? And the first thing you need to do whenever you encounter a question like that is to go back and actually read what the Bible says, because so many of us learn the 10 Commandments and we learn this very abbreviated form. We did not learn the actual verses as they're written in Exodus. We learned one line, we learned the key element of that particular verse. We didn't learn the whole thing. So the verse is found in Exodus 20, verses 4 and 5. Yes, 2 verses, for thou shalt not make a graven image. Right there, this tells you something's off with the way we've learned it. It says, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven, or is in the earth, the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I am the Lord your God. I am a jealous God. So is there a contradiction? I'm watching you look at your microphone.
I'm trying to deal with my children being loud. I'm texting.
I can't hear them, so.
Well, I can, so I'm going to have to edit it out on my end later.
Don't you love them?
Sorry to get your hopes up.
Oh, okay. Well, see,
I
I
kind
just
of know
gave
where
Hector
you're
a treat. I gave him something to chew on. So maybe
well.
your kids need something to chew on.
They go through treats pretty quickly these days. We're having to increase the size of our recipes where they're getting to that age.
Well, I know they can put the treats away when they're here at my house, but I just, I figure it's because they can. But okay, so is there's a contradiction? That's the question I'd ask. Is the temple with all of its imagery a contradiction to the second commandment? The simple answer, the shallow answer is yes. If we just go by the, what we learned for the chart in Sunday school, absolutely, it's a contradiction. And unfortunately, because most people don't take the time to go back and read the actual statement, and they don't take time to know their Bible, and they don't take time to try to come up with an understanding of what's being said here, they immediately say, oh, well, there's an issue here. And this actually hurts people's faith. These kinds of statements hurt people's faith. This is the reason why we're doing this podcast. We want to go deeper into the scripture because if you just keep reading, it doesn't require some kind of great theological, biblical literature degree. It doesn't require commentaries. Just keep reading. The verse tells you why it says not to make these things. You're not to make these things so you can bow down to them to worship them. And the purpose of all of this is to keep us from accidentally worshiping the wrong thing, which we're going to find out with the bronze serpent who's going to show back up. This is the snake that was in Numbers that was the people had to look at to be cured of the snake bite. It's put in the temple at one point, and people start to worship it because it's an image. And it's an image that was used for supernatural healing. But so this prohibition has a purpose. It's not just a blanket prohibition, and it's also to keep people from misrepresenting God. Now, I think one of the problems we have is that we've done this for years, but I think it's gotten worse with social media. We try to teach the Bible in sound bites.
140 characters.
Exactly. We want to condense it. Hey, now my kid's being loud. We want to condense it down as small as possible. Hold on. Hector.
Yeah, that he just wants to be part of the show, right? There he is. So, now I know what you're saying, that we have a bad tendency to stop listening about halfway through. And the
What'd you say?
so we
I'm
have a
kidding.
bad tendency. Yeah, exactly. We have a bad tendency to stop listening halfway through, and I have this happen all the time. I'll give people directions for stuff that, like for example, at my job, I'm the only person who typically deals with certain things, and so I have certain ways of doing things to keep everyone in line, keep everything organized, keep me from making mistakes. And a lot of times it's one or two extra tiny steps that take you about half a second to do, but it saves you going back to double check everything, and having to go through and recount everything 15 minutes.
Right.
So it's stuff like that where it's like, if you now listen to me, do this, make sure you do the second part too, or it's not going to work.
Well, and I really think one of the ways we can really work on this especially, there's a few issues, and I'm not going to go into them because I could get totally sidetracked, but there's a few issues in the Bible where there's one or two verses that people like to build entire theologies on and ignore the context. And by context, I'm not just talking about what the verse before and the verse after is saying. I'm talking about what's said throughout the rest of that particular book, or what's said throughout the rest of the Bible on that particular topic. So one way that we need to start that helps me is if I took those verses out, just pretend like in this situation, like I never learned the 10 Commandments, just put them aside and pretend two things. I can go with one of two scenarios. One is that I'm in the temple. If I'm in the temple and I'm looking around and I'm seeing all this imagery, I'm going to realize, especially if I'm a person from that era, that God's image is the only image that is, it's what's the word I'm looking
Absent?
for?
Conspicuously absent.
Thank you. I kept wanting to mix up my syllables there. So anyway, and when you realize, every other temple you would have gone to would have had this image of the God in there. That's something you would have looked for. That would have been something that you would have been part of your purpose of being there, is to look at that image. You would not have missed the fact that the image was gone. And so the lesson here can be gleaned from the temple itself, is that you realize that the image isn't there. But then think about being at Sinai. Think about being Moses going up on that mountain, having a talk with God, hearing his voice, being engulfed by his presence, so saturated with the light of his glory that people can't even look at you unless you veil your face, not faith, faiths. So anyway, and now you're rewriting the Ten Commandments out. How strongly are you going to word this? It's not just going to be a suggestion that you don't try to recreate an image of God. It's going to be in very strong language. Hey guys, don't do this. You cannot do this. It's impossible to come close to doing anything close to God's image. And it's going to actually be offensive and insulting to try to even capture that image. It comes pretty close to something. There's a concept called negative theology. And basically, negative theology says that you really can't say anything about God. All you can do is say what you can't say about God.
This is particularly popular when you're discussing the Trinity.
Right. Well, and it goes even further than that, because you can't say, like, in some areas it goes further than that. Like, there's some who say you can't say God is good. And the reason why you can't say God is good is because your idea of goodness isn't anywhere close to what it means for God to be good. Or you can't say God is wise because your idea and understanding of wisdom is so flawed and corrupt compared to God's perfect wisdom. And so in order to, now some of the rabbinical schools took this so far as to say, in order to avoid this, you say God's not good, God's not wise, because this is to acknowledge your own shortcomings, not to say that God is not any of these things, really. It's just that God is so far beyond your ability to portray him to the world as wise and good, or whatever other positive attribute you want to ascribe to him. And this only leaves you with the ability to say something negative. And so this is kind of an enacted negative theology, because now instead of having a positive image, a three-dimensional image of God, you have a negative space. And this is a reminder and a visual lesson of how great and grand God is outside and beyond any kind of human understanding. So if you think about these things and you read through the Bible and you just act like you hadn't read that second commandment, you would actually get the principle of the second commandment from the narrative. It's right there. You don't do this because everything you would do would be insulting. Everything you do would be so just shallow, and it would actually lead people astray from a correct understanding or perception of God.
Yeah, and because we are so far removed from this idea of going into places where temples and idols are, we don't see it all the time, especially here in America. There's not a place where there's a temple and there's an idol, so we're not familiar enough with it to know when we look at things to know what's missing.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. And this is the reason why when we look at God in the scriptures, he's never defined. He's described, but he's not defined. Definitions, by definition, say this is where something begins and ends. Here's where the edges are. You can't do that with an infinite being. It's impossible. And so this is the ultimate, hey, we're going to describe him. And how do we describe him? Well, the only concrete elements we can bring to the table are the things that he has created. And we do that by, putting those things in like the lilies, like the palm trees, like the cherubim, like his original uncorrupted creation there in Eden. What does this look like? And try to get as close as we can. And so there's a lesson being taught in the temple, in the creation of the temple. And I think one of the things that we really need to think about with these little sound bites, we need to stop treating them as the whole of the lesson. We need to use them as the key that unlocks the rest of the lesson. Because so often we go, okay, here, I know this little clip. I can spit this out real fast. I can give this little cliche, pat answer, and it's done. It's settled. We don't need to talk about it anymore because this is, quote, the plain reading of the text. This is the literal reading of the text. Where if we used it as a key to unlock greater things, to go deeper, then it becomes something useful. Other than this, it's just a weight. It's just something that we're carrying around in our pocket, wearing holes in our britches. It's not helpful. And so that's the reason why I think we need to be working towards understanding the Bible, not from the point of these sound bites or one or two verses that we take out of context and working backwards into the Bible. We actually will take the Bible and then try to filter that verse through what we are seeing in the rest of the story, in those narrative moments. Because, man, when you build a theology over single verses, single lines, you're going to get led astray. And so God does not condemn the making of images. He does not condemn doing things to be beautiful and pretty. He doesn't tell us that we can't have decorations to honor him. He says, don't try to make an image to bow down to and worship. That's not what you're supposed to do. And so if there's a big difference in attitude and purpose whenever we create something that points us to God versus something that is supposed to be God. And that's the that's the big thing I wanted to get through. So I'm actually I actually had one more point on that because I knew I had something else. It's been a couple of days since I looked at my notes. When we do this, one of the rabbinic principles I think is very helpful is that no law is enacted unless we have two narratives that demonstrate how to apply that law.
Mhm.
I think that's wonderful. I think that is just an absolute fabulous way to filter through the Bible and try to understand things better. I don't, is it a God-given decree to do this? I'm not going that far. But sometimes these little ideas can help us understand. And, when in the creation of the temple, if it had been a violation of God's command, why would God accept it? Because later on, what we're going to see with Solomon's prayer and the what am I trying to say? Inauguration of the temple. That's what I'm trying to say. When we see that become the place where the worship is going to happen, God is going to show his overwhelming pleasure. And, what we find is when it comes to worshiping God, when there is an infraction, he doesn't respond this way. We can look at the golden calf. That was not received. That was not approved of. And God made very clear to the people that this is not to be tolerated. The sons of Korah offering up strange fire, again, not allowed. God made a very strong statement. You will worship me correctly. And then David moving the ark, when he moved the ark improperly, God made sure that, David got the point. You're going to do things according to my command. So obviously Solomon did not violate any of God's commands in building the temple with the imagery, because doing so would have resulted in a death sentence. That's just the way it is.
Right. And when we see that too with the building of the tabernacle, we see it with the building of the Ark of the Covenant, we see it with the building of the bronze serpent.
Mm-hmm.
Which that project must have been really rushed, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I don't think that was a very fine, detailed creation.
I mean, unless you had somebody who was really good, but
It would be interesting to wonder if Bezalel was still around at that point in time and if he was involved. That, of course, that's probably just speculation. But yeah, bronze casting is not something that just any old Joe Blow walks in off the street and starts doing and doing well. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah,
So-
well, I imagine they must have had some kind of setup because they probably needed some kind of like wagons and implements and things to use along the way.
Mhm. That, or or there was extensive trading. There had to be something. And it really is interesting to think about how um how much do they have and how much do they hang on to? Because you watch shows about the Old West and people going across the desert and not desert, across the prairies and the plains trying to get to Oregon or what have you. And what did the people bring? What was left behind? What did they lose along the way?
Oh yeah.
You
Well,
know,
I mean, even like one of my favorite things to do is not favorite, but one of the things I like to do on occasion is I like to go to antique stores because it's kind of like a museum. It's free, and if you really want, you can take some of that stuff home.
right?
The like, and when I say antique stores, I mean like actual antiques, not like
Y-
the
Flea
never mind.
markets.
Yeah, but sometimes those are fun too. But one of the things that I did notice is when I was traveling, when I was doing the pilot car stuff, I'd take a load back east and I'd stop at the antique stores because the farther east you go, the cheaper antiques get.
Right.
Because of that exact reason, the farther west you went, the more stuff they just dumped off the side of the wagon. It's not important. Just let it go.
Yeah, you get put in that situation, you figure out real quick what's necessary to survive.
Mhm.
And, and not to the same level by any stretch of the imagination, but, even living in a camper for 8 years, you learn real quick what you don't need to keep in your house.
Yeah. And,
And
yeah, no need, was it 1883? Mickey and I were watching, and they like left the piano behind, and I'm like, no,
Mhm.
it's terrible.
Yeah, no, but at the same time, can you imagine trying to cross a river with horses with a piano?
And trying to justify that to people who were falling in and drowning.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah, I get it.
the sacrifices that people made to get there were insane. And and basically, what that wagon train trip would take, I think it was 18 months to 2 years or something like that to get through. And
Mhm.
I may be completely off on that, but now we're talking 40 years.
Right.
That's a huge difference. I bet they got really good at economizing. One of my rules whenever I was living in the camper was if it didn't do double duty, I didn't need it. If it couldn't perform at least 2 jobs, then it needed to go. And so, I just got very picky. And, I've moved into a house and I've gotten a lot less picky. It's amazing how quickly the space fills up. But anyhow, that's a topic for another day. So that kind of concludes chapter 7. We're going to move into chapters 8. Uh, and I know we're like taking forever, but this, like I said before, this is what happens whenever I study in little fits and starts because I have time to think between verses about where I'm going to go with stuff or, ask another question that I have to have answered. So it can get pretty random sometimes. And this is just the stuff I'm willing to admit on air that I think about. So chapter 8, verse 1. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes and the leaders of the fathers' houses of the people of Israel before King Solomon in Jerusalem to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord to the city of David, which is Zion. Okay, so the temple's been completed. It's now time to bring the crowning jewel, if you will. The ark of the covenant needs to come home. This is the same ark that had led the nation through those 40 years in the desert. It was the highest symbol of the Jewish faith. Um, it actually is supposed to contain certain sacred items. We'll get into that later. And it is the means by which God brought victory to the land because they often took it into battle with them. Um, this is going to be the ultimate test of whether Solomon's temple is accepted or not. Remember, Solomon would have known, he would have maybe even been present when David tried to bring the ark into Jerusalem the first time, and he would have known how badly that went at the beginning. So Solomon gathers any and everyone who would have been seen as a leader at this point in time. Um, we have almost every title used for Israelite males at the writer's disposal being employed in this one verse. DeVries actually said this assumes a universal male participation in the dedication ceremony. No tribal, regional, or social segregation was allowed since the temple was intended to be a powerful unifying symbol. These men were the spiritual leaders at the very least within their own sphere of influence, but then we also had, it seems to the invitation extended beyond just spiritual leadership. It's every man, probably over the age of 13, and they had to witness this event because they were going to be the ones who are responsible for reporting this out, sharing the news, telling the world and their families, hey, this is what happened on this day. This is how God approved and made sure that we understood this is now his home. Excuse me. It very much mirrors Exodus 19. And, God commanded Moses to gather the elders to witness his appearance on Sinai, God's appearance on Sinai. And, he was present and everyone saw the thunder and the lightning and they saw God's acceptance of Moses as his spokesman and as the leader for the nation. And so we see this kind of being repeated again. Now, I know somebody's going to ask, why not women? Uh, one of the reasons why women would not be included in this is because it is a time-bound command. Women are routinely exempted from time-bound commands. This means anything that has to be done or completed on a scheduled time, women aren't required to uphold. And this is for a number of reasons. Number one, the necessity of taking care of children. It's kind of hard to necessarily keep your schedule and arranged around the needs of your babies. Sometimes they require that you interrupt certain obligations and duties to other people in order to take care of children. Another reason is because of the menstrual cycle. There's always going to be that 1 week out of the month where women are unclean. And so therefore not not capable of participating. Simply by exempting women from these time-bound commands allows women to participate as they see fit. It kind of gives them a little bit of autonomy, and they aren't having to report to someone, well, I didn't do it, and here's evidence of why I couldn't be a participant in this, and here's someone to witness to why I had to miss out on that. This allowed women to have some dignity too. So it's not a horrible thing that women are left out. It's actually considered to be a grace to make concession for the very real needs of just living their lives. So, of course, this is a momentous occasion, and we need to remember that just because women were not commanded to be there, it doesn't mean that they're excluded. It was very much understood that a lot of times when the men were commanded to do something, women were allowed, they just weren't compelled. So women had a little bit more freedom in this area, which is really interesting. And people had to be watching not just to see what God was going to do, but to see, was Solomon going to repeat his father's mistakes, or was Solomon going to get it right? There had to be some major pressure going on right here. And the other really cool thing, that the kind of subtle thing that's going on here is it's in this phrase, the city of David, which is Zion. Now, the ark was already in Jerusalem. We know this. It was already there because David had brought it there. It was, we've mentioned it several times already. That's in 2 Samuel 5:7. Solomon did not need to bring the ark to the city of David. Furthermore, taking the ark to the temple would actually be removing the ark from Jerusalem because the temple is built kind of off-site from Jerusalem. It's not actually in the city. The temple is in the threshing field of Aran, the Jebusite. Words are not wording for me today. But anyway, so when Solomon takes the ark to the temple in Jerusalem, in the city of David, which is Zion, all of these things, basically what he's doing is he's now expanding the city limits. He has enlarged Jerusalem so that now the city limits encompass the Temple Mount too. It's very subtle. It's something that would be easy to miss, but it makes a difference in the political scheme of things because
Mhm.
now God's house is in Solomon's capital city. So, verse 2. All the men of Jerusalem assembled to King Solomon in the feast of the month of Ethanim, which is the 7th month. So, two questions. What's the feast of Ethanim? And why are we told that Ethanim is the 7th month? So, to answer the second questions, we got to answer the first question. Thankfully, almost every commentary is going to answer the second question. You aren't going to have to do a whole lot of reading. Ethanim is the Canaanite name for the month of Tishri. Tishri has 3 different feasts. The first one is Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year. The second is Yom Kippur, which is a time of repentance and considered to be the most holy of Jewish holidays. And then Sukkot. So each of these feasts kind of have a reason to recommend themselves for why it happened during this time. So we're going to talk about that. I just want to look at each of the feasts because I know I was not familiar with the feast for a very long time. And so I know a lot of other people who didn't grow up with any kind of understanding of Judaism don't know anything about the feast. So we're just going to give some highlights. There's way more to these feasts. They're really cool to study because there's a lot of things that where the Bible lessons are enacted and there's something you can participate in. And I'm not saying you need to keep the feast as a Christian. I'm not trying to be a Judaizer, but there's some really beautiful lessons that can be brought out. So Rosh Hashanah, literally, it's the head of the year, and by head, we aren't talking like has authority over the year. We're saying that's the source of the year. This is where it begins. This is where it starts. This is the day when it's believed that God, according to rabbinic Judaism, that God opens the books of life and death. And if your name's inscribed there, you get to enter heaven. If it's not, there's issues. But the month prior to Rosh Hashanah is Elul, and it's considered to be a time of introspection and preparation for the new year. And it's a time to repair broken relationships and to finish tasks and obligations. So if you made a vow to someone, you want to get that vow fulfilled. If you hurt someone, if you've done some kind of sin, this is a time to repent so that you can go into the new year with a fresh and pure heart. And so Rosh Hashanah begins what's known as the days of awe. It's 10 days leading up to Yom Kippur. And after a little, and where the introspection is all about personal repentance, then you move into a time of national or community repentance where you realize that your success as an individual is really tied and interdependent on the community that you inhabit. So you want your community to be prosperous and successful. So you repent on behalf of your community because even though you may not have actively been part of the sin or wrong that your community performed, the fact that you are a part of it, it's still partially your responsibility because communities aren't created by individuals or created by a multitude of people. During this time, God's kingship over creation is reaffirmed. If you look for Rosh Hashanah in the Bible, you're not going to find it by that name. Tradition points us back to Leviticus 28:24-25 as the basis for this holiday. This is the Feast of Trumpets, as in blowing the shofar, because the shofar is blown extensively and multiple times in Rosh Hashanah. Sometimes Rosh Hashanah is referred to as the Feast of Remembrance, and it's celebrated on the first day of the 7th month. And because one of the things in the Feast of Trumpets that you're commanded to do is to remember, and you're supposed to think back over the last year. So, and that's in Leviticus. So Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is found in the next passage in Leviticus 23:26-32. It's considered to be the holiest day of the year. It's the day when people are believed to be closest to God. It's celebrated on the 10th day of Tishri, or Ethanim. It's a day of fasting. You give charity. You bless your children. Believed to be the day that God closes the book of life and death, and so your fate for the year is fixed at that point because it's done. The book's closed. So you want to make sure you get everything right with God before that happens. Again, that's a rabbinic belief, but still very much part of how it's viewed in the today's celebration. After a celebratory meal to break the fasting of Yom Kippur, you immediately begin processing and planning to celebrate Sukkot, which is the Feast of the Booths. That's described in Leviticus 23, 33 through 34, and it's celebrated 5 days after Yom Kippur. And it is observed by building sukkahs or booths or little tabernacles to remember that time of wandering in the desert. This is also known as the festivals of ingathering, where crops are gathered in ancient times, it's not uncommon to sleep in the fields and to watch over your crops. If you were listening during Judges, you know that one of the things the Philistines like to do is to come in, take everything they could get, and burn the rest of the field. So how do you prevent this kind of thing from happening? You sleep with your crops. So we have 3 distinct festivals and feasts in the 7th month to choose from to figure out when was this happening. And because the thing is, they kind of all run together. And the writer of First King does not distinguish for us which feast it would have been. Now, tradition places the day as Rosh Hashanah, and we're going to talk about why that's probably the best candidate. Now, if you're a Bible student, one of the first things you're going to know is that there's a problem with declaring Rosh Hashanah as the head of the year or the new year. And that actually goes back to Exodus 12, verses 1 and 2. And it says, the Lord says to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall be for you the beginning of months, and it shall be the first month of the year for you. This is the opening verses on the passage dealing with the Passover. So we have this issue because Rosh Hashanah is said to be the new year, and here it is being celebrated in the 7th month, and yet we're told in Exodus the new year is supposed to be in Passover, and Passover is held in the spring. So why do we have 2 New Years? Rosh Hashanah was not celebrated as the original New Year's because the commands in Exodus were followed scrupulously, or somewhat, for a while. We can debate that for a while, but anyway. But by 1 BCE, 1 year before the Common Era, Hillel and Shammai are talking about Rosh Hashanah. So we know before Jesus was born, it was part of the popular observance of New Year. Yes, sorry, I cannot say. A scholar named Kaufman suggests a celebration of the 7th month corresponds to the Babylonian New Year, which is used to celebrate Marduk's victory over Tiamat, possibly the result of the Babylonian exile. Now, that kind of makes a little bit of sense, and there might be some ties back with the Bronze Sea and stuff like that. I would really have to work hard to make the case and to make it coherent, but I think we can see the little evidence of some possible connections there. This is possibly bolstered too because in Hebrew, Ethanim, the name used for this month in First Kings, is the Canaanite or Phoenician name for the month, meaning strong or mighty. And it possibly refers to the storms or the currents in the rivers from the waters of the storms. And so that there's some question about why kings use this name for the month instead of the Hebrew name. Now, I'm looking at our time here. We're going to try to get through this because it's this is good.
Go for it.
So in the Talmud, there's a tractate, Rosh Hashanah. It's a Gemara. It's basically rabbinic commentary on Mishnah, which is your oral law. And basically, they're trying to understand the significance of Rosh Hashanah. And so the tractates, they're a lot of fun for me because basically they're presented as conversations with one rabbi who says this and this rabbi says that, and a third one comes in and contradicts those two. And there's this entire back and forth where each side, and sometimes multiple sides, and it's not just 2, sometimes 4 or 5 sides, are being presented. and each one is trying to present their reasoning in a way that is supported by Scripture. So in Tractate Rosh Hashanah, two of our big characters are Rabbi Eleazar, and the other one is Rabbi Joshua. We're just going to go with that. Joshua. Dear Lord, somebody help my speaking. So Rabbi Eleazar says absolutely the first of the year it's Rosh Hashanah. We're there. And so anyway, then Rabbi Joshua, he says it's Passover is the only possible time that can be the new year. So there begins to be this really long back and forth, and each one of them cite traditions about why their view has to be the correct one. So in chapter 10b, starting in verse 10, Rabbi Eleazar says, in Tishri, the world was created. In Tishri, the patriarchs was born. In Tishri, the patriarchs died. On Passover, Isaac was born. On Rosh Hashanah, Sarah, Rachel, and Hannah were all remembered by God and conceived. On Rosh Hashanah, Joseph came out of prison. On Rosh Hashanah, our forefathers' slavery in Egypt ceased. In Nisan, the first month, the Jewish people were redeemed from Egypt. And in Tishri, the future of the Jewish people will be redeemed in the final redemption with the coming of the Messiah. So Rabbi Joshua argues almost exactly the opposite. He says, no, all the stuff that you say happened in Tishri happens at Passover. The only thing that stays as a point of agreement is that Isaac is born at Passover. And each rabbi goes on to defend their position with more detailed stories, most notably the story of creation, which, I mean, obviously creation and the temple are two things that go together. We've already pointed that out. And Eleazar says Tishri has to be the new year, and then that has to be when creation occurred, because there's food ready for Adam and Eve to eat. There's fruit on the tree. And Joshua placed creation at Nisan because the animals had to breed in order to populate the world, to be fruitful and multiply. And then Eleazar supports his claim that the patriarchs were born on Tishri by citing our verse here in 1 Kings 8:2, because Tishri, or Ethanim, which means strong or mighty, must be a reference to the patriarchs themselves. And so from there, we go through this crazy, wild biblical journey and Hebrew history lesson. And they're going to examine all this minutia, things that you and I would probably miss, whether it has to do with agriculture, math, sacrifices. It's really intense, and it takes a lot of concentration to follow. And what's really cool about this, and the reason why I like this kind of argument, is that this is not a senseless debate over when the new year is. It's not even a senseless debate over when does creation happen. The debate is over a very significant theological issue. Which is more significant, being or redemption? Because Rabbi Joshua's position is that the new year must be founded in Exodus, because the redemption of Israel from Egypt is the defining moment for the nation of Israel. Rabbi Eleazar, he's maintaining if we didn't exist, if we hadn't been created, then there could be no redemption. And since there's no redemption, there's no redemption without creation, without being. Now, they never put that fine of a point on it. So if you're looking for them to see these things specifically, you're not going to get it, because that's not how rabbis argued, because they don't care about the esoteric. They don't care about the abstracts. They care about the truths that can be demonstrated in concrete events and events that have happened in history. And this is how you learn what's important theologically, not because you have some highfalutin idea. The perfect ideal, the perfect philosophical argument or reality, that's a Greek thing. In Judaism, it's all about what's enacted, what actually is tangible, what can you participate in. Even all of the holidays, they aren't just simply remembering. You're supposed to put yourself in a mindset of being there, of trying to participate in the pathos and the angst of the moment, or even the happiness and the glory of the moment. Don't just remember it. Try to be there as much as possible by placing yourself within the story. And so, we still ask this question: what is more important? Is our being? is the fact that we were created, is that something we can prioritize over redemption? Or is redemption the thing that sets us apart and makes us a true living thing? I mean, we can't without being, we can't be redeemed, but can we be without being redeemed? Are the two concepts independent? Are they interdependent? And so, these are really hard questions, and we can talk about being redeemed from the beginning of the world. So, were we redeemed at creation? Are we redeemed later? Um, the the point is, all of these traditions and all of these lessons that are held within this celebration of Rosh Hashanah is to pose a question, or not all of them, but at least within this tractate, it's to pose the question of how do we relate to God? Are we simply beings that exist because He created us? And I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I really want to make the point: do we truly exist without redemption? And so that's really a profound thought to wrap your head around and try to understand, because they're wanting to know, can we prioritize one above the other, or do they have to coexist? Because if you get to the end of their conversation, you're going to realize that no side wins. No, one of them doesn't come out ahead of the other or best the other. And what they end up doing is they agree that it's entirely proper for Israel to have two, actually there's four, but at least two New Years. One in which they celebrate the fact that creation exists, and that as human beings, they are human beings, and that they actually do exist because of redemption. So it's a really fascinating thing to read. Uh, you can get it online. That is, again, Tractate Rosh Hashanah. Um, it's I think it's good to kind of read through and to see the thought processes that the Bible inspired among these people whose very lives were defined by the Torah, and to see
Mhm.
how it impacted the way they looked at reality, and how their theological arguments went. Because I think so often in today's society, what we wind up with with theologians discussing these ideas, they almost kind of belong in this rarefied atmosphere that never really touches down. It never really puts its feet on the ground. And so that's the
Yeah,
difference in
yeah,
my mind.
that's one of the thoughts I had earlier. Was like, it's interesting to me how much the Jewish holidays and the Jewish faith
Mhm.
revolves around the natural order of the world, with the calendars and things like that, where um, Christianity, particularly in the West, is very divorced from a lot of that.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, we're gonna go into some more, because I mean, I know anybody who's followed Dr. Heiser's work. I mean, they hear Tishari and they've got, like, bells and whistles going off in their brain. We're gonna bring in a little bit more about that and how that uh plays into the conversation here. But when I read, I had to read the whole tractate. It's like 22 pages long. It's nothing, not a massive work at all. Um, so, I kind of got sidetracked, and I was just looking at the conversation and realizing there's a lot of people who never will read anything to do with the Talmud because it is such an expansive work. It feels kind of overwhelming. So, I think that if you're interested in the Talmud, and again, we take everything in the Talmud with a grain of salt. We don't just accept everything. You want to be careful. This is probably a pretty good place to begin reading, and there's going to be some things that are really going to mess with your head if you dig deep into the Talmud. But there's also some good things like that, because I do think that whole question of, which is more important, being or redemption, and can they be separated or prioritized, is still part of the debate going on today.
So, in the midst of all this, I have something I want to just ask you. I'm going to throw this out there, and you can
Uh-oh.
answer next week or whenever you feel like it.
Okay.
All right. So in your thesis, you argue, I believe in your thesis, or you mention that art is not complete till experienced by an audience.
Correct.
All right. So if we have that, and then we also have that the
I feel like
the
I'm being set
building-
up.
you're-
Okay.
you're being asked an interesting question, I think, is what's being asked. So you have in the account of creation, you have basically a temple building ceremony.
hmm
And the last thing that goes in the temple is the image.
Right.
And that's where man comes in because we are the image of God. So then you have the same thing in the temple. Would that be that the temple and the tabernacle are never actually completed until man is interacting with it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Is that kind of where that
Yeah.
kind of goes? And those two things kind of go hand in hand.
Absolutely. Yeah. Until it is serving the purpose it was created for, it's just a building. And I believe I would need to. I think it's not until the first sacrifices are offered that God actually shows up, and that's whenever
that would
He
make
blesses.
sense.
Yeah, because now it's functioning as it's supposed to function, and the people have witnessed what Solomon has managed to create there. So yeah, and and the same thing can be said, about the Bible. It's not complete until we interact with it.
Mhm.
We can look at various elements of faith. Without our interaction, without our participation, it's like a hammer left in the yard. I mean, what is it? It's a piece. I mean, this sounds almost a little too emphatic. It's a piece of junk until somebody picks it up and actually starts to use it. It's something to break a lawnmower blade until somebody starts to use it. And so, you've got to pick it up and you've got to use it, or it's just going to do damage, or it's going to get completely lost. Pick one.
Mhm.
So, yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why people have a hard time with matters of faith is because they've never actually used them. They've looked at them, they've maybe thought about them, but they've never put them to use for the purpose that they were created for, and they just seem like something heavy to carry around. So,
Okay.
anyhow,
Cool. I like it. Well, that kind of concludes us for today. Everyone, thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoyed it. We made it through.
I couldn't talk. I'm sorry. Maybe next week I'll be
Well,
better.
and my voice is barely here. I'm just barely holding on. So hopefully that didn't annoy everyone too much. But we will see you next week. And in the meantime, Raven Creek SC is where you can find us on the social media. RavenCreekSC.com is the website. And until then, come be part of the conversation, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes or consider supporting us on patreon.com/RavenCreekSC. As always, thank you for listening, and don't forget to join us next week.